Hello, everyone. I'm Melissa Ramirez, and welcome to our first Future of Food event for this fall, Meet 2.0. I'm so excited to see you all this evening, and I'm very excited to introduce you to our two panelists. I'll start with introductions. Like I said, I'm Dr. Melissa Ramirez. I'm a faculty member in biological sciences. I am a microbiologist, and I am one of the instructors for Wicked Problems, Wolfpack Solutions, our course for all incoming students. Hopefully you have heard of it, and hopefully you'll be hearing a lot more about it. I want to start by introducing you to our expert panelists this evening who are going to tell us about how their discipline intersects with the future of food and specifically with next generation meats. So I'll first introduce Dr. Claire Gordy. Dr. Gordy, would you tell us how you got to be here with us at NC State, a little bit about what you do, and about some of the big ways in which your discipline intersects with the future of food?
Hello, I'm Claire Gordy. I use she, her pronouns. I am also a faculty member in the Department of Biological Sciences. How I got here, I started out in Oklahoma. That's where I went to college. I majored in zoology, but got really interested in the immune system specifically, and ended up coming to North Carolina to do a PhD at Duke in immunology. And immunology research uses a whole lot of mice for experiments. And as I was getting to the end of my time finishing that degree, I realized that I really wanted to focus my time on interacting with undergraduates through teaching and mentoring them in research. And I realized that mouse-focused research was not the best thing for that. So I went on to do a postdoctoral fellowship at UNC, where I picked up yeast genetics, and that is mostly what I do now. So at NC State, I teach the undergraduate genetics labs, Genetics 312, where we do yeast genetics research together, both in person and online. I also teach an upper-level molecular genetics course, as well as occasionally a smaller course in BIT, the biotechnology teaching program called Yeast Metabolic Engineering, which is where the students get to actually, in the lab, work on engineering yeast to produce products of industrial or commercial use. Some of those include things that we eat. And so that's where I kind of come into this topic about the future of food. So thinking about some of the ways that my discipline, thinking of my discipline as being genetics, molecular biology, biotechnology, intersects with the future of food, I am largely thinking about how it has less of an environmental impact, but not just on that scientific level. We have to also think about what products are actually marketable to the general public. If you produce something that uses less water to grow, or uses less resources in some other way, but nobody wants to eat it, then you haven't actually made much of an impact at all. So we think about that in terms of genetic engineering in some cases, genetically modified organisms, those sorts of things, but also more traditional old-fashioned techniques as well.
Thank you. And we will talk more about some of the issues that you brought up. But I would now like to introduce you to Dr. Karen Daniels from our physics department. Dr. Daniels, could you tell us how you came to be at NC State and what you think about when you think of the future of food?
Yeah, thanks. It's lovely to be here. And you may be surprised as a physicist sitting up here. So I'll talk a little bit about why that is. So I am a physicist I run a research lab here on campus that focuses on the mechanics of soft materials. And I think we can agree that one of the things that make us like our foods or not like our foods is sort of the mouthfeel, right? And the mechanics of the food in our mouth matters a lot to us in enjoying food. And so how I came to be here is that I have been predominantly a vegetarian since I was a college student, so over 30 years. And so I've been exploring meat alternatives for all of that time, some of them good, some of them not so good. And one of the things that has fascinated me as I'm passionate about cooking and about eating, and I travel the world, and meat is so culturally tied to many, many practices throughout the world, places I visited. When I do eat meat, it's usually because I'm visiting someplace and somebody wants me to try that special thing, right? I do eat meat, but rarely. And one of the things that I have noticed when quote unquote better future meats have gone on the market is that I don't tend to like them because they have properties in my mouth that remind me too much of meat, and I actually don't particularly want to eat meat. And so I'm a very different sort of customer maybe than other people who are trying to reproduce meat-like flavors and textures in order to replace meat in their diet because it is so culturally important to them. And so the question of how we choose to eat meat for cultural reasons is interesting to me. How we choose to eat meat for environmental reasons, right? So what energy it takes, what chemical and industrial processes, right? Release what amounts of energy, take what amounts of energy. These are all sort of at the heart of a lot of physics questions, like where energy goes and how it's transferred, right? And so the reasons that people choose to eat meat or not are often tied to physics questions, like global circulation models, increasing global temperatures that drive those global circulation models. And if methane's from the, outflow of cows are producing these changes, right? This all ties back into a lot of really physics questions. But perhaps the thing that I'm hoping we talk a bit more about is this idea of how texture, right? And to what extent to which the mechanical properties of a substance make us think it's meat or not is sort of where it most intersects my particular expertise.
Thank you. I think maybe a good place to start is with a product that maybe a lot of you all have heard of called the Impossible Burger. And I think that this is an interesting place to start because, at least to my knowledge, out of many of the meat alternatives that are available to customers, this is one of the ones that is supposed to be the most realistic. So maybe it's not something that Dr. Daniels would go for, but it does reproduce, I think, a lot of the properties that we think of when we think about meat. Dr. Gordy, can you tell us a little bit about what is an Impossible Burger? How is that made?
Absolutely. So the Impossible Burger is one that I'm particularly interested in because its sort of special properties come largely from the power of yeast genetics, which might sound surprising. But the Impossible Burger is essentially a plant-based burger, just like a generic veggie burger. But what makes it different and what makes it taste and feel more like meat is the presence of heme. So you might have heard of hemoglobin. That is something that's present in your blood that carries oxygen to the cells of your body. And that is really one of the key things that make meat taste like meat. It's that bloody flavor that you taste in meat, particularly meat that has been the less it's been cooked, the more you're going to taste that sort of metallic, meaty flavor. But the heme that's present in the Impossible Burger is not heme that's coming from an animal product. It is actually produced in yeast. And it's produced in yeast by taking the genetic code, the DNA sequence, that encodes the hemoglobin protein that's present not in any animal, but in soy, in the root nodules of soy specifically. And taking that genetic code and putting it into yeast and causing the yeast to produce that hemoglobin protein as they ferment. So you're essentially fermenting yeast like you would do to brew beer, But instead of collecting alcohol that they're producing, you're collecting hemoglobin. But it's not animal hemoglobin. It's hemoglobin that was originally encoded by soy. That protein is then isolated and it's used in the making of the Impossible Burger. And that is what essentially gives it that meaty feel and taste.
So I have a question for you on that subject, is that both the taste and the texture are going into how our brain perceives this. And so how does the Impossible Burger process generate, I mean, when we think of burgers, you have little, clumps of meat separated by other, next to other clumps of meat, right? And so what's the process by which you get that sort of granulated, weakly held together matrix? Is that done in post-processing?
I actually do not know that.
Oh.
Yeah, so I mostly know about the genetic engineering they do to produce that heme protein, and their marketing at least tells you that that contributes not just to the taste but also to the texture. Yeah. But I am not sure if they do anything different from other plant-based burgers in terms of the sort of processing and the forming of the physical shape of the burger
But so the
patties.
heterogeneity, right? That, like if you look at an Impossible Burger, it doesn't look like the inside of a hot dog.
Right.
It's not uniform, right? So
No.
this uniformity, I think, if we bite into meat, we can tell whether it's a hot dog or a hamburger, both by taste and also, by that heterogeneity. So there must be some industrial processing that's going on
I assume so.
to break that
Right.
up into bits.
Yeah, we have a question. Go ahead.
I was just going to say, that's probably just the texturizing of the vegetable protein.
Okay.
So that's been done with soy for a
So it's,
while,
yeah.
just to make fibers, essentially, to make it like hamburger.
Yeah, and what's interesting is some of the lab-grown meats that are made fungus, right, take advantage of mycelium already growing long fibers. So mushroom fibers are already long and stringy, and so I know some of the mushroom ones already have that just as the mushroom grows, right? It already generates strands that then feel more steak-like or chicken cutlet-like because they have the stringiness that you expect. So there's an alignment of fibers as opposed to little dots.
Right.
Yeah.
Yes.
So is there yeast present in the actual burger itself or just that protein?
So it's just the protein. They're growing the yeast in sort of a batch-fed fermentation system, and they're isolating the protein, but they're not putting the actual yeast into the burger, though there certainly is yeast in many vegetarian food products. But in this, they're just specifically adding the protein.
Could you repeat the question?
Oh, yes.
Repeat the question.
Sorry, the question was whether the Impossible Burger contains the yeast cells themselves or just that protein produced in yeast.
Yeah, the reason I asked is I don't know if you've ever purchased any of the Impossible Burger that's actually in a tube like thing. And I've noticed these things are always under pressure. They're actually, in fact, the longer they sit in the refrigerator, the more they ferment.
Oh, yeah.
I was wondering what's going on inside that,
Oh.
causing, there's some outgas in the process.
So the question is that the follow-up is that in some of the Impossible products that are not just the burger patties, but the sort of tube-shaped meat products, that if you keep the product for a while, you start to notice sort of a gas production within the tube and a buildup of gas over time, and whether that could be coming from yeast. So I am not certain where that's coming from, but I would say that if there are yeast in any of their products, I would not think they would be alive or metabolically active, particularly if kept under refrigeration. Yeast won't grow and divide and produce carbon dioxide like they do when you're fermenting with them at their preferred temperatures when they're in the refrigerator. But I'm not sure where the gas is coming from.
But shelf stability is a really interesting issue. I mean, this is sort of, if you think of all the consumer products that we buy, if you think about, if you buy yogurt and liquid has, risen to the surface, or, shampoos that require shaking before use, that a common property of soft materials is that they will phase separate, right? That parts that were supposed to be together will gradually drift apart. And so technologies that sort of maintain something in the original texture, again, whether it's, a cosmetic product or a food product, the techniques are often, quite similar, is to add things called surfactants, so surface active agents that change the surface tension, right, and cause things. So for instance, the reason you can, blow bubbles, right, is that you've added something that changes the surface tension of water, and, soap is a surfactant, but there's lots of natural surfactants as well. And a common food processing, so for instance, mayonnaise is a bunch of bubbles of water and oil mixture. And actually the garlic or mustard in there is providing the surface tension that keeps the mayonnaise stable. And so a lot of these food processing things require tweaking the ingredients to get the chemistry, to get the surface tensions just right so that they stay shelf stable. This is quite a challenge. Because you can't put soap. It has to be something you can eat.
So as you were talking about the Impossible Burger, I started to think about those properties of texture and how exactly sort of the properties of the plant, I can see how would be very difficult to manipulate them in such a way to make it be whatever type of meat sort of product you're going for. So I can see how there would be a need to have sort of meats with different texture properties depending on what you were trying to use, substitute it for. And this brings me to this idea that you touched on a little bit, Dr. Daniels, of wanting your food to either to be very meat-like or maybe not. And so what are some of those factors that we have to consider when we're thinking about the properties of potential meat-based substitutes? Like, in which case would we pick something that would be very meat-like versus in which situations maybe we're okay with it still maintaining those sort of plant-like properties?
Okay. I would say it depends sort of on who your audience is and who your consumer is for this product. So when I last taught Yeast Metabolic Engineering in person, we ended the semester with actually bringing in products that had to do with the projects we were doing in class, including Impossible Burgers for the students to sample. And we had some vegetarian students in the class. And much like Dr. Daniels was discussing, those students felt okay ethically eating the Impossible Burger and that it didn't have any animal-derived products. But when they bit into it, they were like, no, this is not for me, because it felt like meat and it tasted like blood. And so, that is a product that is really not made for vegetarians or vegans. It's a product for people who eat meat but want to eat less of it, or want to have additional options. So really a company has to go into something with a clear idea of like who they're trying to market to. And if they're trying to market to folks who don't normally eat meat, they probably are not going to want something that is so similar texture and taste-wise to actual meat.
And I think that, the marketing question is really interesting because, if I think about, communities around the world that have prohibitions on eating beef in India or eating pork in Muslim and Jewish communities, right, that something that reproduces those features may be distasteful in a very, very deep and visceral way to folks from those communities. And yet, I know I have family traditions, in my own life where, steak is always served, right? And so my ability to participate in that family tradition, is enhanced if I have something very steak-like, right, to include in that, right? That makes me and my relationship with my friends and family stronger, right? And so I think that, these marketing strategies, and this is something that, part of a really sort of liberal arts education, right, is needed to understand, when are you having resonances, with culture and history that are beneficial, right? And when are you having ones that are actually going to be negative? And that, knowing that is incredibly important for technology folks working in this sector to keep in mind.
I think as scientists, we can be so excited by the technology, right? And wanting to know, oh, well, if we tweak this, can we make it do this, or can we do this?
And this has led me to try a ton of Meat 2.0 products that I don't actually like because I'm so fascinated, as a scientist at how they've achieved, and I'm actually excited to try the barbecue, which we will get to in a minute, because, we know what pulled pork is supposed to look like, right? It's supposed to have stringiness. If it doesn't have stringiness, I don't know what it is, right? And so these are things that I'm fascinated by as a scientist. How did they achieve these particular, rigid in this direction and soft in that direction? So for me, it's been really fun exploring this space, even if it's not, something that I'm, probably going to eat a lot of long term.
I think it brings, or it really makes clear for me the importance of having everyone at the table while you're developing these things, so that if you're, so that at every step of the way you're not missing something that would be completely obvious. You just didn't have the right person there to raise that that obvious point. Are there instances that you can think of where something has maybe been brought through, a technology's been pushed forward, and then all too late you realize that, wow, this was just really a miss? And when we didn't have the right people in the conversation?
I know of namings that have gone wrong, right? So apparently the Chevy Nova was a poor seller in Spanish-speaking countries. And they had to rename it, right? So I know of places where, like, sort of obvious marketing, from a language standpoint. Maybe people in the audience know as well. I'd be interested to hear of places where something wasn't considered.
I think we can sometimes get so excited about, like, the technology that we realize then that maybe we were trying to fill a need that wasn't really there, or maybe there was a solution that was completely acceptable. Are there instances when our biotechnology gets ahead of us a bit?
There are certainly instances where the biotechnology gets ahead of us. I'm having a hard time thinking of a specific example, but I did see a hand in the audience.
Oh, yeah.
I was just going to say fat-free anything.
Fat-free anything.
Fat-free anything.
Yeah,
Boldly where no one
Yes.
I would, yep.
Yeah.
and remove key ingredients that people needed.
Yeah, so it's nutritionally bad. And actually, there's cool, those actually have great stories with how a lot of really interesting engineering went into making products that without the fat would still stay having a mouthfeel that anybody would find remotely attractive, right? And so much work went into making those products as palatable as possible, and yet they probably should have just left them.
That's a great
That's
example.
really good example. And yet intellectually fascinating. And there's actually an example I know of where fat-free mozzarella, some of people have made the experience, if you melt it and then it solidifies, it looks kind of clear, right? It's like, talk about unattractive, visually unattractive, right? And it turns out that what's doing the light scattering, right, that makes mozzarella look white is the fat globules. And so if you don't have the little round fat globules in there scattering the light, it doesn't look like melted mozzarella. It looks translucent, like think frosted glass on top of your pizza, right? And so, in fact, this was a solvable problem. They put in other scattering agents that scattered the light and made it look opaque again, right? And then people had the image of the mozzarella matched what they expected to see. Our senses, all of our senses are involved in eating. And it's once the light reflection matched what we expected, people were unfortunately more willing to accept it, although, as you just made the point, maybe should have left that on the table.
I do remember Crystal Pepsi from my
Oh, yes.
childhood.
Yeah. And there was also when they made the purple and green ketchups,
Oh, yes.
right?
Did not need to happen.
Right, and so that's just another example of you using all of your senses to
Right.
know what you're supposed to expect with a food. I think another place that's come up a lot recently is when folks lose their sense of smell because they have COVID, which I know is less common now with the current variants, but over the past several years, there are people who had COVID 2 years ago and never got their sense of smell back. And that completely changes how things taste or whether you can taste things at all.
Yeah.
And so it'd be interesting to know how, if this is, an ongoing thing where we have more and more people who can't smell, how that impacts what foods are developed.
And I think it's interesting, go back to the heme that we started with. The visual that when you cut into the Impossible Burger, there's actually, it looks like blood running out. That visual clue tells you it's a real hamburger, right? In ways that a veggie burger doesn't usually give you that clue. And I think that actually, for some people causes a positive reaction, for some people causes a negative reaction, but it's something that we're reacting to visually, even before we put it into our mouths.
So I wonder, as scientists who teach a lot of students in your specific discipline, for somebody who's interested in food and physics, what are some of the ways that a student might sort of take classes or sort of what career paths might be there for somebody who's interested in both the physics but also food?
Yeah, I think, I often use food as teaching examples in class because people have this common experience of food, right? So they make wonderful teaching examples. But the fact is, your undergraduate degrees are meant to train you to be well-educated humans, right? They're not so much meant to train you to be a specific kind of, labeled with your major person. And the ideas that, we learn about in physics classes of understanding what makes something soft or hard, right? These are translatable into food science, right? And so I think one of the fun things, I think there's a lot of undergraduates in the audience, I'm guessing, because this I know who was advertised to. And, one of the things to think about is when you take your, bachelor's degree, where you're heading, I know enough about gel formation kinetics to guess what the solution should be to fix the problem, right? So, I put physics principles to use in the kitchen, quite routinely. And that's, not my job, but it's certainly my life, and I think that benefits my life. The other thing to think about is I do think there's a real role in sort of having people who are trained in the hard quantitative science, hard meaning quantitative, not hard as in difficult, the quantitative sciences, go into things like, consulting and environmental policy and all these sort of jobs that are out there that, sort of work on the stream of options of all the stuff we have, right? For instance, there is someone who graduated from my lab who I got a call from at the beginning of the pandemic because, we work on soft materials and suddenly there's a shortage of the polymers that go into masks, right? And so he was asking, he works for a consulting company, right? And they're worried about supply chain, right? Where these things come from, right? And I think there's a lot of places where this sorts of knowledge, right, get turned into consumer products and consumer safety and evaluating them, right? And those are all people who often have technical degrees as bachelor's students.
One of the things that I find so amazing about being at a university is the ability to always be learning from world-renowned physicists and food scientists and people whose discipline is really outside of my scope of expertise. Dr. Gordy, are there disciplines that you get to interact with that you just know nothing about?
Oh, all the time, absolutely. So, and this is related to food actually, but one of the places I've learned the most over the past many years since I've been here is through interacting with people in very different fields surrounding issues of food insecurity among NC State students, learning from folks who are sociologists and in all different fields approaching, real issues impacting our students. I've also learned a ton interacting with folks here at the NC State Libraries in the makerspace, learning how to 3D print things and design 3D printed objects, and that's useful in terms of creating tactile models that students can use to learn about complex concepts in biology, but also sometimes 3D printing lab equipment, things that, I don't exist in the exact size and shape that I need them to be. We can make them ourselves. And those are not things I ever would have known myself if I were not at somewhere where I could interact with people with very different skill sets and backgrounds.
So Dr. Daniels, if you weren't a physicist, what other discipline is really interesting to you?
Oh, gosh. I think I've become, as a physicist, I run a research lab. I often travel for work, right, to other countries and have people in my labs who come from all over the world. And, learning other languages and learning that the way that I think is normal to do something because I was brought up that way, and how that differs, the obvious differs in other countries, and understanding how those cultural norms arise and persist, often over very long periods of time, is, and that's sort of at the anthropology, sociology, I think is utterly fascinating. And I read about it, but I'm not a practitioner. And that's completely not physics, right? And how structural biases sometimes then, make things persist for long periods of time, right? Through, structures that are often in place, from very long traditions and are therefore very difficult to break. So the robustness of things, actually, maybe that does share something in now that I'm saying this, why are some structures robust and others fragile? Maybe that is something that there's a common thread there. I had not thought of that before now.
What about you, Dr. Gordy? If you weren't an immunologist turned yeast geneticist, what would you want to be when you grow up?
Oh, gosh. So a couple things. So I also love languages and minored in French and considered graduate school in French. So that would be one possibility. Another is that before I taught science, I taught ballet. I was a dancer. So that is something that I have always loved, and in another lifetime, another timeline would consider doing as well.
Yeah. Of course, please.
So in your experiences or just from your own knowledge, a question for all the panelists, do you find that most funding for this kind of research, Meet 2.0, is it coming from industry? Does the government have an interest? Or is it mostly just coming from the Impossible Burger companies?
So the question is, where does the funding for these type of Meet 2.0s come from? Is it largely funded by industry, or is there interest in government funding agencies in funding this sort of research?
I think that depends on what angle you're approaching it from. So there are very basic science sorts of angles that would definitely be fundable by government funding agencies. NSF being one, but depending, if you're looking at something if you're looking at like tissue engineering projects that could go in a direction of lab-grown meat, but also, lab-grown tissues for medical purposes, that could be of interest to NIH. There is definitely industry funding as well, but I think it really just depends on what exactly you want to do and how you spin what you want to do to the funders.
Yeah, and I am not funded to work on this. I'm mostly interested in this, like I said, as a consumer. But I do have colleagues who I meet at conferences that I go to who do work on things like this. And, the tools they have in their lab, which are basically, machines for testing material strength and, failure modes and things like that, they're the same. They use the same equipment to study the food science that I use to study non-food, right? They're literally the same techniques, right? And the difference is actually in who funds it, right? And so when they're working on things that aren't food and aren't consumer products, they're often getting funded by the same people I'm getting funded by government agencies to do basic science. And when they're working on more applied topics, they often are funded by industry groups, right? And I think what's nice about that is that, when industry turns to academics, to fund a project, it's because they realize the problem is sort of broader than the specific, they need to solve a specific problem, right? But they realize that someone in academia who has encountered a wider range of problems might come up with solutions that they wouldn't come up with from their narrower experience. And so it's of benefit to them to fund an academic project to get that breadth of expertise, right? And they recognize that that also comes with, possibly pie-in-the-sky academics. And, so that they've made a decision that that's what, they're interested in usually. And I have experience with industrial funding for other projects, and that's, been very much my experience.
Could we please show our video from our NC State graduate? So sort of in the vein of interdisciplinarity, we have a NC State alum who I believe had an NC State degree in engineering. He had a successful career as an engineer, and he is now the CEO of a company called Barbecue. This is CEO Lee Cooper. Unfortunately, he couldn't be here this evening, but he was very generous in providing us with a tasting of their plant-based barbecue. And we're just gonna take a look at Lee Cooper's company, Barbecue.
And I just want to add, this is thanks to University Dining that we have a couple of different kinds of barbecue, and they're serving it in Fountain Dining Hall tonight also.
In the heart of North Carolina, one smokehouse stands alone. In the land of hardwoods and pines, mountains and Piedmont, waterfalls, rivers, and ocean, stands a smokehouse that works in tandem with its surrounding beauty. In a land where farmed animals abound, there's a smokehouse that crafts barbecue from plants. In a land where food traditions run deep, there's a smokehouse that nourishes both body and soul. In this land stands a smokehouse that represents the future of food.
It had all of the things I look for in a barbecue sandwich. I'm really excited to try it. So Lee Cooper
So Dr. Ramirez, I think, something I think is worth mentioning is, unfortunately, he couldn't be here tonight, but his engineering company was engineering valves, right? I mean, so this is, talking about people switching, their interests. Like, this is a big career change for someone, to take, and I think this is the value of education, right? It's not that we're training to do one specific thing. It's like we're training to be, able to do many things that we might think of.
Right, and Lee Cooper has been a lifelong vegetarian, something he was very passionate about, having a positive impact on the world. And so he made a career shift from engineering and pursued a passion project that is very successful. So I wish he could have been here with us. I think he'll be maybe attending one of our Future of Food events later in the semester. So he can come and visit and answer questions that about how you actually bring a product like this to market. How do you go from idea all the way to somebody's dinner plate? And we have barbecue tasting for you there in the back. And do you have any other announcements you would like me to share?
Are there other questions from the audience?
Yeah.
Where's that business located?
It is based in North Carolina.
Quick, someone Google it.
Outside of Charlotte,
okay.
okay.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah, yes.
Can I ask our physicists maybe to step away from her specialty and to talk about something that's important to many vegetarians like myself? One of the reasons why we chose to go that route is because you recognize that there's so much low-grade energy loss
Yeah.
in the process of raising all these animals of
Yeah.
various sizes.
Yeah.
And I wonder what exactly I mean, there's a lot of energy that's going into the physics of processing
Yes.
substitutes.
Yeah, and so it's not a given that any substitute for meat will necessarily be will be more energy efficient than the animal. That's not a guarantee. You actually need to do a pretty careful energy analysis to come up with that. And so if you think about it, if you need to build a plant that has a lot of metal parts, where does that metal come from, right? All the refrigeration needed to store it, right? There's a lot of energy costs in producing these things. Now, over a lifetime of a factory, those get spread out for a long time, right? And so doing that full analysis is actually quite a difficult calculation to do. Okay? That said, methane production from cows is a pretty serious greenhouse gas, right? And so it's also, aside from the energy, there's also the burps and farts, right? That all of us, ourselves included, are participating in. And it's not necessarily true that everything that's plant-based is more energy efficient than everything that's meat-based. And I think an example that I know of that's somewhat surprising to me is that if you think about small fry, little anchovies that you can just catch by nets and then just eat, they turn out to be one of the sort of the lowest energy forms of food. If you're talking about just like energy to get calories into my stomach, right, which is not the only criteria that we want to go by. But if that were your only criteria, anchovies are excellent because you pack them in salt and they don't, they don't require refrigeration, right? They're easy to drag up by the zillions. You may not want to starve the fish who depend on them, right? There's lots of other considerations. But if energy were your only question, right, there's some surprising answers, right? And veggie burgers that require perpetual freezing can actually be quite energy consumptive, right? And so this is a really tricky analysis to do. And there is reporting out there that you can find it, which is why I know some of these, sort of where they rank. But people do not market on the basis of this, right? People tend to think that vegetarians are vegetarians for ethical reasons. Oh, I can't bear to, eat fifi, right? And that is, a really strong reason to be a vegetarian, right? But people are vegetarians for a tremendous number of reasons, and energy should absolutely be something that I think more places are willing to market on. Because it's a big concern, and it's really difficult for a consumer to calculate that. I can decide I don't want to eat animals because they haven't been ethically raised, right? And I can sort of know that because I can ask the farmer and how they slaughter their animals, how they're raised. I can get that information really easily. Energy budgets require really, really a lot of technical knowledge to figure out. So it's a really good question to be asking. Yeah. But some of these ones that are sort of grown, they kind of just grow pretty easily once you build the factory, right? And so it's really a startup energy budget, and then after that, it's not as much.
This question is still forming as I'm speaking, so I apologize if I'm my words, but I've seen stuff about banana peels, with watermelon ham, and recently I was looking into a salmon sashimi that was made out of algae and it had no flavor to it. It was more aesthetically pleasing plant-based meats are affecting meat consumers' thoughts on vegetarian alternatives.
One of the meat eaters want to take that one?
So the question gave some examples of non-meats that would be used as meat substitutes, and we got maybe some not appealing, not so appetizing examples. And I think your question is, how do those examples maybe also have an impact on whether or not somebody would be willing to accept a meat alternative? Is that?
Yeah, it's more talking about those more unattractive and more, a lot, I would say, like food trends, because it's all about visuals on the internet and not necessarily about flavor and texture.
So what is the impact of the visuals on if somebody wants to take a try with one of these meat alternatives? And I think it goes back to that point that when we eat, it's not just about nutrition. It's not just about the taste or the smell. It's about how it looks. It's about who you're with. It's about things that are culturally important. It's about so much more, right? So I think that it's probably very context specific. And I'm sure that in the right circumstance, people like to be adventurous eaters as well and
the
try those
novelty.
things. Yeah, the novelty, exactly. What
I
other
also think
questions?
experimenting, I mean, the space in which people are generating new products, which, may or may not actually live long-term, like that's sort of capitalism doing, in a good sense, right? That some entrepreneur has an idea, they try it, people turn out they love it, right? Then we've got a great new food that we didn't have before they did that, and it's really fun, right? To try new things, novelty seeking. I think, I think there's a place for even things that seem off, that seem off. Maybe they'll catch on. But I've had banana blossom fried up, like fried fish, and I thought I was at the seashore. It made me so happy. Because again, it's like these, this is like, I grew up eating meat as a child, and so for me to be transported to eating fried fish, right, it felt, that made me happy, right? And I was happy that it wasn't actually a fish, right? Even if it was a banana blossom, which seems peculiar.
So I think meat has a really big masculine advertisement. Do you think that will ever change?
So the question is about the advertising angle for meat, and that we're presented with this very masculine aesthetic when we think of like a big steak or a burger or something. And will that change? I think that if there's a market, somebody will find it and make it
But
make it palatable.
We
for
just got
that
gender
market.
studies in the mix. I mean,
Yes,
we are
yeah,
hitting all the
exactly.
topics here. But, I think that, these are things that, again, are cultural, right?
Right.
And, and if we have the power, I mean, social media, drives how people, think about stuff and makes things that were cool, not cool, and vice versa, right? And so I don't know. I think we are malleable, right?
Yeah, there's just a lot of people, or a lot of people not wanting to make the change because it's such a masculine thing.
Oh, I see.
So do we think this is maybe then a
Oh,
benefit of having, fake meats that look more like meat? Because they preserve that cultural tradition of grilling things and so forth that a lot of, not uncommon that people have families where the men gather around the grill to grill. And if you can grill
Absolutely.
something, right, you may be able to preserve that social function without it being actually meat. You can carve, yeah, but it doesn't look good.
So in the marketing video that we just watched, did you all feel like that was a masculine presentation of that product?
Yeah.
Yeah, I felt that way too.
The
Yeah, so that's.
question- would you like to
the
repeat
question.
it?
You can repeat it.
The question was about the any nutrients that might differ between next generation meats versus traditional meats, and if there would be maybe some adding back of missing nutrients.
And so I would say that that is more or less like where the Impossible Burger is going, because it does have that hemoglobin, which is where the iron is coming from in the meat. And so its iron content is going to be more similar to what you would see in an actual meat-based burger. And if there are differences in the ability of the body to absorb iron from different sources, and iron coming from hemoglobin is more easily absorbed than other plant-based forms of iron. So that's going to be more similar nutritionally to a meat-based burger. But just with sort of the introduction of that technology for engineering these yeasts to produce this product that then goes into this plant-based meat, you open it up to engineer in all sorts of other nutrients as well, because yeasts are a very, very easy, inexpensive organism to engineer to make more or less anything you want. So in the Yeast Metabolic Engineering course that we teach here at NC State, the students actually metabolically engineered the yeast to produce beta carotene, so they turn orange. They're producing essentially a precursor for vitamin A. And that's something that undergraduates are able to do in a matter of a month or two in the lab course. So you could very easily start to think about what other nutrients you would like to engineer into your meat-based product and do it that way if we find that the public is accepting of this sort of yeast engineering technology to add these things back into the meat products.
Are there any other questions from our guests? Yes.
Basing it on yeast, and I guess that turns it into a GMO.
So the question is adding the nutrients back in on engineering yeast, whether that turns it into a GMO, yes. Yeah, so the Impossible Burger has two GMO ingredients. One is the soy leg hemoglobin that's produced in yeast, and the other is just soy protein from genetically modified soy. And so yes, anytime we are moving a gene from one organism into another, that makes it into a genetically modified organism. That does not necessarily mean that we are adding something to food that isn't already in other kinds of food. We're just sort of moving that nutrient and the genetic capacity for making that nutrient from one organism to another. So that would be genetically modified, yes.
I feel like GMOs are just going to increase in utilization for this reason to create other foods from foods so that we have more sustainability, and we're going to have to go toward more GMO anyway.
So the question is whether GMOs are going to sort of increase in their frequency due to this sort of move towards sustainably producing foods and changing the ability of different organisms to produce different things for foods. I would say yes, but I would also say that GMOs are already present in essentially all processed foods. Anything that has corn that's a processed food is almost 100% going to be genetically modified, and many, many other products too. So it's already being done for different reasons, for reasons of like crop yield and reasons of protecting crops from pests and things like that. And that is probably going to continue to be, I think, the major reason that we have genetically modified foods. And I think this move towards producing particular nutrients or ingredients in different organisms than where they originated is probably a smaller contributor to GMOs in our food system.
So the question is, are the risk of foodborne illness the same with an Impossible Burger as they are with a regular burger?
So this might really be a question for the microbiologist here, but
I would say that they are different. If we think about beef, for instance, many times the risk for contamination of the beef comes in the processing of the beef when you ground it, when you make ground beef. And so that would be different. Our food is not sterile. it's never sterile. We just try to limit the potential for foodborne pathogens to grow. And so while we might not have the risk of the same pathogens that we worry about with beef processing, it doesn't mean that we eliminate the cause for food safety just because we're moving to a plant-based system.
A nice protein-rich environment is going to make a lot of microorganisms
Yes.
happy.
Microbes like food, like all of us, right? Anything that's fatty, sweet, I mean, what's not to like? The microbes love it too. All right, if there's no other questions, thank you so much for coming out this evening, and we will meet you in the back for some barbecue tasting.
I'm so excited to try this.
Yeah.
I'm actually from an organization that's working with a lot of the food companies and universities. And one of the reasons I wanted to come today is there's a bunch of students from UNC and Duke University that have already formed what they call an alt-protein coalition. We haven't really had many NC State students participate. There's been some faculty. So if any of you are interested in wanting to participate in this, let me know and I'll make sure you're on the list.
Thanks so much for that.
Thank you.
There's definitely so many exciting things to be done.
Oh, and if you are here for a class, you can come up and take a selfie.
Because we're told that's a thing that you might need to do.
Thank you.